Well, good afternoon and welcome to our webinar. I think we're just giving everybody about 30 seconds to log on and make sure that we have everyone. We'll give everybody just a few more seconds here. And then well, it's just past noon, or excuse me, it's just past 3 p.m. I'm sitting in California. So let me say good afternoon and welcome to our webinar entitled Advance with Africa, which is co-hosted by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the National Association of District Export Councils, or NADEC. My name is Suzanne Sterling, and I wear several hats today. I'm here in Sacramento, California, as a member of the Northern California District Export Council, but also as a board member of the National Association of District Export Councils. However, I have a very strong link to the Chamber world, and one of our hosts today, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in particular. My day job, so to speak, is serving as Vice President of International Affairs for the California Chamber of Commerce. I'm very pleased to say that both the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the NADEC are very excited and passionate about changing the narrative around the African business climate and working on new opportunities for American businesses, large and small. In particular, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce has a nationwide roadshow and campaign called Advance with Africa, aimed at increasing U.S. businesses' understanding of commercial opportunities in Africa, which you will hear more about today. And from what I understand, when asked if looking for new export markets, please consider Africa. You may not know as much about the National Association of District Export Councils. There are 60 local DECs around the country, comprised of over 1,500 international business executives and trade experts appointed by the U.S. Secretary of Commerce and working with the U.S. Department of Commerce on export promotion and commercial diplomacy. The National Association of DECs provides support and guidance for fulfillment of this mission, and we are deeply honored to be working together today with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce on several international fronts, including the Advance with Africa initiative. I should mention that today's webinar will be recorded and available on both the NADEC YouTube channel as well as the U.S. Chamber Live. In addition, the Education Committee of the NADEC holds monthly international websites, so please keep an eye out for those. So the bottom line is that U.S. companies of all sizes have a unique opportunity to engage on the continent of Africa. And I know both the NADEC and the U.S. Chamber are very pleased to have you join us all today. Now let me turn this webinar over to our wonderful Chamber colleague, Scott Eisner, who is not only Senior Vice President of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, but also serves as President of the U.S. Africa Business Center, and who will add his welcome, and I know he will outline today's program further for us. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much to NADEC, to Susan Sterling, an old-time friend of the Chamber and really one of the leading trade policy advocates in this country. It's always been a pleasure to partner with anything you're doing, and today is a prime example of these partnerships we bring to the forefront. Again, Scott Eisner, I oversee the Chamber's Africa portfolio. It's a pleasure to join you all today, friends and family from across the country and across the world. We know we have participants joining us from across the continent, throughout Europe, and across the United States. So it's a pleasure to bring you a new opportunity to think about how you can invest in trade and partner with African businesses. I want to thank, again, our friends at NADEC, Rick Wade, Ambassador Dos Santos, the ambassador for Mozambique, Camille Richardson, a great partner of the Chamber's Deputy Assistant Secretary of Commerce, Michelle Knowles, Managing Principal, Head of Trade Policy, working at ABSA, one of our sponsors today. I do want to thank again NADEC, ABSA Bank, who's a lifelong partner of the Chambers, and Prosper Africa, one of our implementing partners for our Advance with Africa series. Before I get started, I want to give you a brief introduction to the Africa Center. We are really focused on enabling American companies and providing them with real-time intelligence to help them access the African market. This isn't just focused on large companies. We're working through this series Advance with Africa to bring together a consortium of businesses, of like-minded individuals to understand the really important role African markets play, both in our present, but also in our future. We're doing this in a means to bring to the forefront and bring to the market these opportunities, and where we can help you with our partners in government and across the private sector demystify and de-risk what is the perceptions around Africa. As I mentioned, the Chamber represents large and small companies doing business, and we have a real sense of what the opportunities are, but also realistically where the challenges are. And I don't think the challenges just exist on the continent, they exist throughout the world. And where the U.S.-Africa Business Center is poised is help demystify, as I mentioned, and deal with real-time challenges. We're also very aware of the gaps and deficiencies within our own systems that bring us here today, to bring us here together today. Advance Africa is born out of years of conversations and planning, conversations with government leaders who wonder where America's mid-cap companies are, conversations with American business leaders who maybe not the scale and size of some of our largest blue chip companies, if you will, but really have the gusto of and passion around trading and investing in a global stage. The missing link has been, how do you tap into some of the government resources that can mitigate the risk and really help defer some of the costs? We also want to tap into communities that tend to be overlooked by the nature of the system. So we want to make sure that minority-owned businesses, diaspora community, have an opportunity to play at the same level and get the same information that companies of all sizes have. We want to engage those that have been traditionally left out or underserved by international trade. This has been one engagement in our nationwide tour. In September of this year, we launched in Atlanta our Advance with Africa campaign, bringing together diaspora populations, minority-owned businesses, public sector leaders, and private sector leaders into one auditorium to really help to start to demystify how the world was going to approach Africa in the next generation. The Chamber is very proud to be one of the partners with the Department of Commerce for the upcoming U.S.-Africa Business Forum, and I'm sure you'll be hearing a little bit more about that later in our program. Now is the time to understand, as in any new market, there are risks, but yet also there are amazing opportunities throughout the continent, a continent that is comprised and that will be comprised of 40% of the world's workforce by 2050, and through the intra-African trade, it's estimated to raise between 50 to 75 billion in just 20 years. For those entrepreneurs and businesses that are on the phone with us today, or friends of yours that are wondering how and where do you start expanding your activities in Africa, look no further than here. We are going to have a vibrant discussion today with diaspora, minority-owned businesses that have successes in understanding the complexities and the opportunities the African market presents, and the amazing opportunities that are involved in partnerships. And really, that's what we want to take out of today's conversation, building partnerships for sustained economic engagement for the long haul. These aren't opportunities that are one-off in nature. These are opportunities that are going to pay dividends for all investors. It's now my distinct pleasure to introduce Rick Wade, a longtime friend, a true advocate, someone who knows how business and the government can work hand in hand through his previous experiences of leading the U.S. government through his time with former President Obama to leadership positions in the Department of Commerce. Rick is now in charge of our strategic alliances and outreach at the U.S. Chamber. He develops and implements programs and initiatives for the Chamber to help develop new business relationships and partnerships across diverse audiences. His counsel to us in the Advance with Africa world have been immeasurable. And by that, I mean, he is a true leader in every sense of the word. So Rick, without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to you and the rest of your panelists. Thank you so much for your partnership.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you for that introduction and the partnership that we have to help with Advancing with Africa. Thank all of you for joining us in this session, Advancing with Africa, How I Did It. As Scott talked about, if we are going to advance mutual economic growth between the United States and the continent of Africa, quite frankly, it doesn't start in Washington, D.C. It starts on Main Street. It starts engaging our small and medium-sized and women-owned and minority-owned businesses across America. It starts by helping to increase the understanding among the U.S. business community of what opportunities exist on the continent. laying out how small and minority firms can reach African markets. So this conversation is designed to do just that. It's not just a start, it's not just a beginning, but it is a process that we're ever evolving and growing to help businesses enter and do business on the continent of Africa, and to help those who are already in to grow and to prosper even more. And hopefully we'll be able to provide you some perspective on how to get that done. And no other way to do that than to bring on two amazing CEOs who are doing it, who are doing it every day. Please join me in welcoming first Barbara Keating, founder and CEO of Computer Frontiers, an expert in driving technology solutions throughout the globe as an entrepreneur, an innovator in government, as well as the private sector as a U.S. government contractor and an IT outsourcer to Fortune 500 companies. She's led the company's work in over 60 countries, including 42 Africa countries. And as well, Rich DeGay. Rich is the president and founder of R&D Engineering. Please join me in welcoming Rich, an engineering and manufacturing firm located in Livonia, Michigan. R&D Engineering expertise is in building specialty machines that help manufacturers reduce their cost per part and achieve greater return on their investment. Barbara and Rich, thank you for joining me this afternoon for Advancing with Africa, How I Did It. Let's jump right in, because I think we have a lot to cover in a short time to get there. You think about, as ventures think about that next step of how they should be thinking about engaging on the continent of Africa. I imagine it's everything from picking the right target market to logistics and adaptation. Do you have a local partner? It's pricing, it's customs, it's marketing, it's all of that and more. And I imagine that can be quite intimidating to many. But Barbara, let's start with you. How did you approach your initial entry into doing business on the continent, and how do you get started?
Well, thanks. I am interesting in the fact that I'm kind of a government created baby. I started in Peace Corps, and so then that was my first entry into Sierra Leone. So I worked in Sierra Leone for 2.5 years, and so I have a little bit of a different edge, but it still comes to the same kind of piece, which is you have to understand where you're going before you can invest there. So whether you go as Peace Corps, or you go on a trip, or you take a year as a tourist, or something to do with the US government, before you ever would put money there, you have to understand the place. So that was kind of the first piece for me that laid the groundwork. But when I actually started putting businesses in Africa, the first thing I did was actually I used the World Bank, their registry of ease of doing business in a country. And although a lot of countries complain about that index, it does give you an idea of how much local government involvement you may need if you're going into a country. And in all honesty, that can be a bit of a negative. Now, I have a different view of it now, and I'll explain that later, but where we really need to, in this day and age, combine US and local government and national governments in other countries together to make things work. But initially, that was one of my criteria, was that, okay, how easy is it for me to get in and operate without having to have undue connections, or with the government. The other thing that I really looked at was like the banking linkages. Like, can I easily have a direct mobile access to my funds, and to understand what was going on in the country. Now, initially, when I started 20 years ago, that wasn't happening. And so that became a big factor later as I started to set up new companies, was that I would not set up in a country if I could not get access virtually to my banks. Another piece is that country focused on education? That's a big piece. You can train anybody as long as the government has provided some basic education, and then we can work with anybody to develop them. but you have to have those basics in place, and that shows that the government really cares about their people, and that makes it a much more interesting place to invest. So those are just some of the pieces I looked at.
Yeah, well, listen, thank you. That's a lot of great information. Rich, what about your story? I mean, how did you get going? You were probably a little unique because I think you have roots in Cameroon. By the way, that's where I trace my roots back to as well, Cameroon.
Okay.
So good to see you, my cousin.
Good to see you, my cousin. Thank you. I do have roots in Cameroon. I'm a native from Cameroon. I've been in the US for the past 30 years where I migrated. So this is my home country now. But I am originally from Cameroon. And that is one of the points where I went back to when I decided to start businesses in Africa. But as it may seem contradictory, at first I thought it would be an advantage, the fact that I'm originally from Cameroon, but it was also a blind side in the sense that I had the perception that I knew what I was doing going back and trying to launch a business. It took a couple of failures for me to realize that I did not know what I was doing, and I needed to apply the same thing that I was applying elsewhere, having been in other countries such as Canada, Mexico, Brazil, China, and so forth. So as I start doing that, which were basically in my case, unlike Barbara, I'm coming more from from a private sector side. So I went with the government, and in this case, the U.S. Department of Commerce, using Gold Key and single company promotion, which are products that are offered by the U.S. Department of Commerce to help company promote their service and get in touch with better partner in country. So going from that perspective, I was able to launch locally a laboratory. We now have the largest network of laboratory in Cameroon, and we are the only partner of Mayo Clinic in Africa. Beyond that, we are now in the process in getting into the agro business. We just signed this past month 2 contracts, and I'm poised to go back in a couple of weeks to sign with 50 more communities. There is also now another partner that have heard about what we are doing in the agro industry in the neighboring country of Chad, who has been adamant that that we come there also. And this was just yesterday that we were negotiating that. And I'm in the process of negotiating with my kids to have their permission to leave before Thanksgiving, to be able to go to Chad, to be able to sign a contract there as well. What I can say is this. A lot of time, Africa is perceived as what it used to be, meaning a country that were only looking for handout, a country where the elite were not educated, the country where businesses didn't know exactly what they were doing. That's then. Today, the elite in Africa in general have been educated in world-class universities. They are very well versed into business. They know what they are doing. They know where they want to go. So knowing that would enable a lot of US company to find a place to go. We very frequently hear about China being ahead, but I believe that it's because mainly from the US, it's mainly the big company that are there, the Caterpillar, the Boeing, the ExxonMobil. The small business are not there. Part of it, I believe, is because of the wrong perception. And part of it, I also believe, is because of some of the risk. And I suppose maybe we'll get into those things a little bit. But in my case, it was mainly through the Gold Key and basically through the Department of Commerce that I was able to get in and establish myself.
Yeah. Well, listen, thank you for mentioning Gold Key. I think foreign commercial services at Commerce and other agencies are just rich resources that they have and tools. So thank you for sharing that. Barbara, to continue what Rich started, that is about the myths and misconceptions about the continent. I mean, I'm always struck by the reality that the young population is set to nearly double to 2.5 billion people by 2050, which is just fascinating when you think about market and opportunities. But what are some of the misconceptions or or myths that you perhaps have to confront or have confronted as you've been successful on the continent?
There are many. So I'll just start with one that still continues, which is I'll have, I'm from the Midwest originally, so I'm from Wisconsin. So I'll, when I was traveling, and even, even now, they'll say, well, where do you stay over there? And I'm like, what are you talking about? Well, where do you sleep? And I'm like, in 5-star hotels. I mean, so there's just this concept that there are huge cities in Africa. There's a lot of wealth in Africa. It's just such a misperception. And it's also a perception based from our reality. I mean, I work with people who have more land than, than I could ever have in 100 years. And so it depends on what your values are and what you're actually looking at. So that's one of the biggest like misperceptions, and it just leads into everything of like not understanding that the internet in many cases is better than here because how the laws and things were put into place. And I helped with some of those a long time ago. And so they were able to just expand exponentially across the continent. And so it's really a misperception of what can be done in Africa.
Yeah, and nowadays, quite frankly, probably as a unintended consequence of the pandemic, I mean, I think we elevated the role of virtual knowledge and breaking down those barriers because we can connect and talk to each other. We can see each other around the world, and so that actually is a big asset. If you can't get there to the continent, there's no reason not to learn about the continent. Rich, you mentioned obviously being from Cameroon, and one of the things that Scott and at the U.S. Africa Business Center and that we're all focused on is engaging more of the diaspora entrepreneurs. But what recommendations or guidance would you give to that diaspora entrepreneur who wants to make the shift to trading between the United States and Africa?
Yes, I will go from where maybe Patricia left off, which is the perception. The perception is not just from American native per se, but it's also from the diaspora. Because from the diaspora coming here, we are acquiring the culture of where we are. And we don't realize how much that culture changes us. So when I say that I went back and it took a few failures to realize, what I was realizing was also that my filter had changed and I had acquired a certain perception. The perception, for example, of corruption in the diaspora it goes up very big, where the perception is that the country are a lot more corrupt than they truly are. So there are a lot of those perceptions that the diaspora has of Africa, of the country that they came from, that prevent them and impede them from going back and investing. The perception that everything will be taken away from them. The perception that because they come from abroad, people would just be there to try to take advantage of them. The reality is that there are a lot more wealthy people in Africa from almost any country than their diaspora is. The wealthiest African is in Africa, is in Nigeria. He's not in the diaspora. So the diaspora also build that aura that they are special, that they are better. And I think that that's something that plays against being able to have a good business relationship. Having the right measure, I think, is what is needed. So being able to be conscious that there is that filter and looking to level that filter. So it's not just the outsider, but it's also the people that have left that have the wrong perception of that. So that's what I would say would be the biggest impediment, is the perception that the diaspora has of what goes on, which does not match the reality.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you. But Barbara, so perception and risk. I mean, is there a differential? Talk about the risk. I mean, there are, imagine, doing business in America, doing business anywhere there's risk. But what comes to mind as perhaps some of the risks that entrepreneurs and folks need to think about?
Well, just coming off of what Rich had just said, there are investors in Africa as well that you should be pursuing, and that helps to mitigate the risk.
Yeah.
So that's a piece of it that you really need to look at. And also, Rich, I'll just tell you this as well, is that often when I hired people from the United States who were from a certain country, I would never send them back to that country. The failures were when I sent them back to their own country. They did fabulously when they had to adapt to a new country, but their own country, whatever expectations, and also of people there were like, oh, you're just think you do it better, you know, and they're not, you know, and so no matter, even if they were trying to adjust. So I understand that fully. But it is to also mitigate the risks using US government resources, using the embassies, using those kinds of pieces. I didn't do that in the initial years of my company. The embassies weren't really set up for businesses like mine. And what would happen if something went wrong and I reported it to the embassy, they would send a wire back to Washington. Okay, that didn't really help me. And whereas the Chinese ambassador would go for his companies and go and sit with the president on the issues that they had. So I wasn't getting that kind of support, but I think that is now changing. And I think that there's a much better relationship between our government relations and who we are and our companies. So
Yeah. How important is it to have a local partner? I mean, we talk about that sometimes, but is that,
can I answer that?
Yeah.
So initially I did, my first country was Uganda, and I had a local partner, but the main reason why I started there was that President Museveni, no matter what you may think, he was saying, I would not want somebody to tell me I had to have a local partner. So please come start your business and you don't need to have a local partner. So there was a plus in that, in an openness, you know. And so I started in 2000. That was my first company. So those kinds of things can help, but you do actually need local partners or local investors to help you get going. I would still say you need that.
Yeah. Well, listen, we could talk all afternoon and more, but Rich, I want to give both of you kind of a closing thought here, and that is, what more can the U.S. Chamber, what more can business in America, and even on the policy front, what more can we do to create more Riches and Barbaras and successful enterprises such as yourselves, to create this mutual economic opportunity between the continent and the United States? Any parting thoughts? What more we can do?
What I would say, the first thing I would say, that we will need more of these, more of interaction like this that allow people to be aware of the reality of what the things are, that allow other small businesses that have been there, have done it, to be able to share their experience. The other thing that I would say is, from the government side, the realization that it is the small business that is the backbone of the US economy. It will be the small businesses that will be the backbone of our foreign policy in that stage. If at home, the big businesses are not the backbone, overseas they cannot be. And the government needs to readjust, I believe, the approach there to give some space to the small business. The small business definitely cannot do it alone. They would need also the big businesses along, but the small businesses definitely would be there. And to be able to counter China, as is the policy of the US, and to counter all those other threats, to be able to project the ideal of what America stands for, we need the small businesses, because the small businesses, for me, is the representation of the people of America.
Thank you. Barbara, any parting thoughts?
Yeah, I would say that we just need, even across the board, basically a policy on Africa, which we don't have. And so we have all these different agencies that kind of work at cross purposes. This is not something new. This has been talked about in the past, but we need to really have it done in order to move forward, because that is what China and other countries do have. They have a across the board policy, and so they're able to have their companies understand what they're supposed to be doing and where they can get assistance. We don't really have that. So we have a patchwork of pieces. So we just need to be more cohesive in our approach.
Good. Well, listen, Barbara, Rich, thank you so much for joining us in this conversation, Advancing with Africa, How I Did It. You're doing it, and we're very proud of the work that you're doing, and look forward to continue to work with you in the months and years to come. Thank you again for joining us. Please welcome now a moderator for our next panel, my colleague Kendra Gaither, Vice President of the U.S. Africa Business Center here at the United States Chamber of Commerce. Kendra, turn it over to you.
Thank you, Rick, for passing the microphone and for hosting such an inspiring conversation. I think it sets the stage well for this next component of the conversation, going from those great examples from Rich and Barbara in terms of how they've done business on the continent, what perceptions they've had to confront, maybe some opportunities that they've seen that others have not seen, and really dive deeper into what tools and what support is available for small and medium enterprises to really pivot to or take the plunge to trade with or invest in Africa. So I'm pleased to invite 3 panelists to help us to explore those issues a little bit further. As I introduce you, I invite you to turn on your camera so that you can be seen to our virtual audience. And I want to give a pointer to our virtual audience. I see we have the first question that's been posted in the Q&A chat. Following our conversation with this distinguished panel, we will have a moderated conversation and respond and pull out questions that you've posed to our fireside chat, our SME leaders, as well as to the executives and officials that we're about to speak to. So first, let me welcome to the virtual stage, Michelle Knowles, who's the managing partner and head of trade and working capital product Pan-Africa for ABSA Group, one of our national champions for this Advance with Africa program. Camille Richardson, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Commerce for the Office of Middle East and Africa in the International Trade Administration of the U.S. Department of Commerce. And His Excellency Ambassador Carlos dos Santos, Ambassador of Mozambique to the United States, who also has the distinction of being the co-chair of the Economic Development Committee of the African Diplomatic Corps here in Washington, D.C. So good afternoon, panelists, and good evening to Michelle, who's joining us from South Africa. So indeed, we are well represented in terms of participation from across the Atlantic. But I'd like to start with a question for all of you. Perhaps I'll start giving deference to His Excellency Ambassador dos Santos to start us off. We heard really inspiring comments from our panelists in terms of how entrepreneurs have approached investing on the continent. But I'm wondering if you could sort of set the stage for us and tell us why you think now is the time to engage the continent and why companies should be looking to make that pivot or entrance into Africa. Ambassador, over to you first.
Thank you very much, Kendra. First and foremost, I wish to thank the Chamber for inviting me as a representative of Africa to speak on this panel. As I always say, we don't take these opportunities for granted, and we thank the Chamber for doing this, because one of the challenges we always face in trying to attract more investment is lack of knowledge, a lack of information about what our continent is, where it is now, the development on the continent. And having a platform like this is great. Why do I think the continent is ready for investment and open for investment? It is quite clear that our continent, everyone says, is the next frontier, but I think it's a frontier that has always been there, and that those who have been in the continent have discovered that a long time ago. Some are even investors from the United States. But the continent is ready because we have done a lot to create the conditions for good corporate, economic, and political governance. We have challenges, yes, we recognize them, but we are solving those. we are also the right place to go because that's where you find the mineral wealth, you find the young people of the continent with their ingenuity, their capacity to innovate, and they have shown that they can create and they can partner with many investors and other stakeholders that want to get involved with the continent. I think it is also right to have this event at this time, especially now that we are preparing for the Leaders Summit of His Excellency President Joe Biden and their excellencies, the leaders of the continent of Africa, who will be in Washington, D.C. in December to create an environment that is even more enabling. And I think I want to take a point that was referred to in the first panel, which is the perception of risk, which is not conforming to the current reality. Those who are in Africa now investing know that the rate of return on investment on the continent of Africa today is much greater than in the United States, than in Europe and elsewhere in the globe. So this is the place where you can have a huge and relatively rapid return on investment. Is there risk in any business? Yes, but you need to know, you need to understand the culture of the place and work in partnership with the locals. And that's what I think will be the messages that will come out of the summit that we will have soon. The embassies here, all African embassies here, are your first port of call. We may not be as efficient as you may wish, but we are definitely here to serve you, those of you who are interested in Africa, to inform you about the continent, to help you start a business, to help you to visit, to help you to learn about the culture of the continent. So all these factors, to me, supersede. I think they are more than the challenges that you may encounter. And on the challenges as well, if you engage and you are willing to work with the Africans, you'll soon realize that actually you have good partners on the continent.
Thank you, Ambassador. And thank you too for mentioning the US-Africa Leaders Summit that's coming up in December, because I think it does raise the profile of why this time of now is important. Let me turn to Das Richardson to offer a perspective of why entrepreneurs should be seizing this moment right now in the way that the ambassador described.
Well, thanks so much for the opportunity, Kendra, and thank you for the invitation to join you here today. We mentioned some demographics, some statistics at the beginning of this, and let me just revisit them because that's what we do here at the Commerce Department. Africa has some of the world's fastest growing economies. And by 2030, in just 7 short years, there are going to be 2 key milestones that are reached. Number one, the African population is estimated to grow to approximately 1.7 billion with a B people, and their middle class is expected to triple. So that means there's a stronger labor pool, skilled labor pool that has more purchasing power than ever before in history. Additionally, we expect the continent to become home to 1/5 of the world's population, 20% of the world's population. And most of the population of Africa right now, 70%, is below 30 years old. So then looking forward again, 2050, you're looking at Africa having the 3rd largest population in the world after China and India. So what does that mean? If you're not starting to explore that market now, if you're not starting to target opportunities, if you're not leveraging public and private resources to figure out what's my strategy? Where do I go first? What do I have to sell that makes sense in this growing market? You're leaving money on the table. You're missing an opportunity. And unfortunately, in this country, we have decades of misinformation, fed to us by the media about Africa, such that, and I was very surprised to hear that as a diasporan, that even folks who come over from Africa and immigrate to the United States end up coming up with a skewed view. So yes, there are challenges, but one of the things I think that entrepreneurs really bring to the table is that they are pioneers. And if you want to look at Africa as the final frontier, at least on this planet, I think that this is a good time to do that. Why? Because it takes time to develop relationships. It takes time to find trusted partners. It takes time to do your homework. Start investing that time and energy now, and it will pay dividends later. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for that call to action to look at challenges as opportunities, because certainly that's how we view it here as well. And I'm sure Michelle would agree, coming from the private sector. So Michelle, if I could turn to you and maybe ask you to say, from the business standpoint, why do you think this moment right now is really critical for entrepreneurs to engage on the continent?
Thanks, Kendra. And just to echo the thanks to allow us as ABSA to participate in this important discussion. I think we've heard the statistics around Africa, and the fact that Africa is really poised to become a significant consumer market for American goods and services. We've heard around, today Africa is home to some of the fastest growing economies. We've seen over the past couple of years a lot of ongoing efforts towards regional integration and economic cooperation. I think importantly, as we continue to see stress in supply chains due to increased competition and the current geopolitical events, there really is a focus on Africa and the role it plays as a market for US exports, as well as being a manufacturing hub, as we already are for other parts of the world, thereby addressing some of the risks and instability that has emerged in supply chain. And we've really seen positive examples of this in markets like Uganda, Morocco, and Zambia. If I hone specifically into trade, despite all the supply chain and other global challenges, Africa's trade flows have really accelerated quite significantly. And the IMF data shows that the dollar value of Africa's exports to the world has increased by more than a third over the last year, and are up by more than half from pre-pandemic levels. We're also seeing exciting increases in trade values within the continent. Exports up 37% in the first quarter of 2022 as compared to a year ago, up more than 40% post-pandemic. Driving some of this growth is shifts that we've seen in trade flows from Europe and markets like India. And there's renewed focus on initiatives to increase two-way trade and investment between the US and Africa, and hence why we're having this discussion today. The US is one of the top 5 important export partners, especially from a sub-Saharan perspective. So I think a lot of opportunity exists. Honing in from a company perspective, exporting for many businesses is first and foremost a way of achieving growth and diversifying revenue pools, as well as creating new revenue opportunities. Why is this important for us in Africa? Well, today we contribute probably 3% to global trade, and a 1% increase would generate in the region of about $70 billion of additional income annually for Africa. So the time is right in terms of expanding into the continent.
Thank you, Michelle. I think that was, again, another full-throated endorsement about why companies today should be taking this opportunity seriously. And I saw that the chat has been lighting up, and because this NADEC community is very savvy, they've raised some questions around due diligence and risk and some of the challenges of doing business on the continent. So I want to stick with you, if I might, because obviously we're talking about Africa en masse, but obviously this is 54 countries of different shapes, sizes, unique market opportunities, and systems, particularly when it comes to banking and frameworks, and all of those being distinct from one another and distinct from the United States. What are some of the considerations, around risk? And I know that you have a unique perspective on this, but what are some of the considerations or risks that should be considered when importing from or exporting to a new market?
Thanks. I think that's a great question. And, I think when you start importing or from or exporting to a new market, of course, managing cross-border risk is key to ensuring that your business grows successfully and sustainably. And that's, either domestically or internationally. But of course, when you trade cross-border, your risk is higher than when you trade domestically. You need to consider additional elements such as the laws and regulations of foreign jurisdictions. So this could be things like central bank exchange control regulations, prohibited good export controls. You need to also consider country and political risks, sanctions, etc. Foreign exchange risk. That's really around the availability of foreign currency and its conversion. Should you have hedging strategies in place? Of course, first and foremost is also your counterparties you're dealing with, which really translates into your credit or your commercial risk. So this is considering things like your settlement risk. What settlement method should I use? Will my buyer pay me? You, of course, are facing some performance risk if you're importing. Will the exporter deliver or perform in terms of the contract? And then, of course, which was mentioned earlier, the logistics of importing and exporting. Overarching everything is also always fraud risk. How well do I know my counterparty? Again, I must state, and I think it was said in the previous discussion to you, that this risk applies to any cross-border trade. But it is important that you are working with a bank that has a strong track record in international trade. They've got a very good understanding of the markets that you operate in. Of course, in this case, that would be Africa. I think one of the points that we always do note is we often reference Africa as a collective, as if it's one country, but it consists of 54 different economies. Each have its own regulations and nuances. What banks can do is assist importers and exporters to manage some of this risk through different trade finance solutions. And that ensures that companies are able to mitigate risk while driving growth in their chosen markets.
Thank you for that. You really laid out some really key considerations. Again, I think that viewing challenge as an opportunity and risk as something be mitigated or to be optimized is a great perspective for the can-do spirit of an entrepreneur. Might I turn to you now, Das Richardson, for a question? We heard a little bit from Rich as he talked about his experience doing business on the continent, and he spoke about the Gold Key Service program.
Yeah.
That's one of many tools that we know are available that the U.S. Commercial Service and that the U.S. writ large provides for U.S. companies who are seeking tools or seeking some support. And I'll just note that in the chat, there's support for more officers to be across the continent and all the U.S. embassies. So, this community is a key champion for some of those tools. But as we talk to the companies here on the line who are looking forward and ready to make the jump, what are some of the resources and tools that are available? And really, where should they begin to look for or access these tools?
So thank you so much for that question, Kendra. And I'm hoping that, as part of our NADEC audience, that a lot of the companies are already familiar. So just consider this a refresher if you're already familiar. But let me just start off by saying that a really great resource for all of you to go to is our website, which is at trade.gov. And on that website, you're going to find information about all of our U.S. Export Assistance Centers, or our offices across the United States, which we consider to be our domestic field. So we have 106 offices, 106 U.S. Export Assistance Centers, or USEACs for short. And these are staffed by very knowledgeable, very experienced trade specialists who are essentially there. And you can think about us in this respect like a global consulting company, right? And because you pay taxes, you are all shareholders. And so you get to access these services because you paid for them already. So you can go into any U.S. Export Assistance Center, any USAC near you, and you can speak with a trade specialist, and you can sit down with them and talk about your products, your services. They can help you to actually map out an export strategy, whether it's regional or by a country or even globally over time. And then they're going to take the information. We're also big information brokers. So they'll take the information that we produce around the world at our commercial posts and through our country commercial guides. And so not everybody reads these because they're fairly large. If somebody tries to sell you one, don't pay for it. It's all online and it's free. Our competitors have figured that out. They take our stuff and put it up on their websites. But at any rate, my point is you can look by your industry sector at a particular market and figure out and use that information to help you figure out, does this market make sense for me? And a trade specialist is happy to work with you in that respect. And so then once you've decided where you want to go, when you want to go, how you want to go, it might just be as a single client, as a Gold Key client, where a Gold Key is essentially an individual trade mission. Maybe you want to go as part of an actual trade mission. And so that information is also going to be on trade.gov, where you have opportunities to travel, as part of an organized, commerce sponsored, or even a partner like the Chamber. We could be collaborating on a trade mission. We just did that to Africa, to Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire in June with our deputy secretary. So a lot of times we have these executive-led trade missions that also help to open doors for U.S. companies, but all that information is going to be on the trade.gov website. So you decide where you want to go, how you want to go, when you want to go, and whatever you decide, we have experts on the ground. We have officers like myself who are stationed at commercial posts and embassies and consulates around the world. We have 11 of them on the African continent, and where we don't have an office, we usually have a partner post that's sponsored by the State Department. We have 23 of them across the continent. And so all of us are there. We're there to help you. We have locally engaged staff. We have local staff from the countries where we are, who are well positioned to understand how business is done in a market, who can basically help to save you time and money, lower your risk by telling you before you even get on a plane if the market makes sense for you. And if it does, and you decide to do a Gold Key, for example, then they can set up appointments for you. They can help you to hire a driver or an interpreter, book a hotel, everything that you need to come into a market and to find a trusted partner. And before you sign that contract, we actually also have a vetting service called an international company profile. It's not that expensive and it's worth every penny to keep you out of legal trouble or legal issues, because we would have screened and vetted this person for you. We would have gone to their place of business. We would have talked to their suppliers. We would have talked to their clients to offer you extra assurance that they are who they say they are, that they're an established entity in the market, and that they're able to be an appropriate and trusted partner for you as you look to build your business in that market. So that's a super quick overview of, as an entrepreneur, some of the services that we offer to help you get into the market. If once you get into the market, you run into some challenges, we also have free commercial diplomacy and advocacy services to help you overcome challenges and to pursue public tenders that might be on offer, so that we're there to position you all along the spectrum of growing your business through trade, through export with the continent. Thank you.
Thank you. Before you go, Des Richardson, we're getting a number of sort of market-specific questions where some of our NADEC communities traveling to Senegal and looking for partners in Nigeria and the like. Without putting you too much on the spot, could you share with us the 11 countries where there's a commercial commerce presence? So
I knew that was coming, Kendra.
I was glad you were ready for me. I thought you might be.
So let me start at the top in North Africa. So we have 3 posts in North Africa, and that would include Egypt, which is our regional post. It would also include Algeria and it would include Morocco. So those are our three North Africa Levant posts. Then if you move down to sub-Saharan Africa, let's move east to west, I guess, and then south. So over in East Africa, we have posts in Kenya and Ethiopia, as well as Tanzania. And then moving kind of across to the west, we have Nigeria. So you're covered in Nigeria. We also have Ghana. And then as you start going a little bit further south, we have Angola, South Africa, and Mozambique.
Excellent. So that's a great place for those who are interested to start, and particularly since you mentioned trade.gov as a point where they can find that information. I just wanted to make sure while you were on the subject that we broached that.
Thank you for that. And it's quite possible that we have a partner post in Senegal. I just don't have that information on the top of my head.
Thank you. We'll take a look at the website to be sure.
Okay.
Ambassador Dos Santos, may I bring you back into the conversation, because we heard from Camille about how the U.S. government helps provide support for U.S. companies entering the African market, but obviously African governments have their own export and investment promotion agencies. A country like Mozambique, which you have the great honor to represent, is differentiated by its growing growth rate, and is obviously one that's very attractive to new entrants into the market. Can you tell us from the perspective of Mozambique, or on behalf of your African colleagues, beyond coming first to the embassy in Washington, D.C., as you noted, are there other services or other resources that your government and African governments have to help welcome these investors into the market? Ambassador, I'm afraid you are still on mute.
I was muted, sorry. Thank you very much for that important question, Kendra. I think the most important thing to say first and foremost is that Africa is open for business. African countries are really ready to partner with US companies, US investors, and to attract tourists from the United States. Those who have been there will say how great the continent is. Now, what do Africans want? I think it's important to understand that if you are going to Africa. There are abundant natural resources. Now we speak of critical minerals, and we also speak of the abundant fertile land for agriculture. Africans want to develop those resources, but what they want now is to make sure that they add value to those natural resources, to those critical minerals, and to process their agricultural products in Africa so that they go to the market as finished products, and you have a good return on investment, and the Africans also benefit, and the communities also benefit. So these will make it a good partnership if the investors go there, not just to extract, but also to process, to work with Africans to process and sell to the international market. As we know, this is possible, and some African countries are doing it. Mozambique is one that is trying to boost agro-processing and also creating conditions to process its own minerals within the country and then export them. This is possible, and I think it's the way to go. All African countries, and Mozambique included, have investment and export promotion agencies. Mozambique has what we call APX, which is an acronym in Portuguese for the Agency for the Promotion of Investment and Export Promotion, for the promotion of investment and exports. And this agency is a one-stop shop where you can be helped to do all the things that Camille has just pointed out. So now you have two entities that can help you to start your business relatively easily. So you contact your embassy, but you can also contact the embassy of that country, and here the embassy of Mozambique in this particular case. And I'm happy to have here at the embassy has the commercial counselor, former deputy director general of this agency I was talking about. So this gentleman is here to help me and work with other colleagues of the team at the embassy to inform and to facilitate and to help those wanting to go to Mozambique to do business. Now, Mozambique is a new global province of natural gas. I'm glad to say that the floating LNG plant is exporting its first LNG this month. And that will also boost economic development in all other areas of the economy of Mozambique. And if we had problems in the past, today we have an IMF program that is working well. I was in Mozambique just a few weeks ago, evaluating the first 3 months of the implementation of that program, and all indicators show that the economy is doing relatively well, even with COVID, even with the impact of the international markets and the disruption of the value chains. The economy of Mozambique is still showing growth. Of course, starting from a very low base, so we need to sustain this and increase even more. But this shows that there is opportunity for business people to come to the country, make additional investments, and waiting for later, maybe a little bit late, and then you lose the momentum. But of course, any time is good time to start investment. And if you have your niche, you have your competitive and comparative advantage, you can come and work with us. And as I say at the beginning, the embassy here is your first port of call, and we can assist in any way necessary.
Thank you, Ambassador. I have to believe that many on this call will take you up on that red carpet you've rolled out to the embassy, as well as pointing out that one-stop shop in the form of APX, which we know has counterparts across the continent to help companies who are looking to enter the market to better understand what is needed and how they can contribute to the value addition and the necessary tools and equipment to be supporters of that. So thank you for that description. We're starting to weave in a few of the questions from the Q&A as they come in. And so I have one here that I'd like to perhaps redirect to Michelle, if I might, for a moment, sort of sticking around this concept of risk. It's one that you touched on in terms of some of the solutions that banks can offer in a bank like ABSA, particularly one that's got local context. But there was the concept of relationships being really critical in terms of knowing your counterpart and your clients. Can you tell us from a support perspective, some of the things that ABSA does, to further provide support for mitigating risk, or, perhaps, identifying clients or counterparts in particular sectors? I noted a question around wine, given that you are based in South Africa and it's a wine country. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that. But how can companies begin to better assess and access some of those tools to mitigate risk?
Great. Another great question. And I think we've heard from the panelists around really the huge amount of tools and support. So I'm going to hone in really specifically around what banks can do to help exporters around optimizing risk, because there's always going to be some risk, but also around financing. And maybe just taking a step back and saying, Why do companies need trade finance? Well, if you look, trade is typically done on terms. So there's usually very different objectives between buyers and their suppliers when it comes to payment terms. Naturally, importers or the buyers would like to delay payment terms, especially if they need to onward sell. And from an exporter's perspective, ideally, you would want money up front. And of course, that's particularly important for SMEs. So what trade finance does, it really helps bridge the funding gap between the credit that is provided in terms of the trade, as well as the need to obviously fund stock and debtors. When you consider your payment method, it is important to understand, that there's some settlement methods that mean more risk for the buyers, but it offers greater and increased protection for sellers or the exporters, and others operate so that the exporter takes on much of the risk. So it is important that you consider this in your commercial terms. What trade finance does, it provides you with the solutions that help you again manage cash flow requirements as well as optimize your risk. And there's two broad categories of solutions that bank will offer importers and exporters. Those that really help you optimize risk, it's those risks we spoke about earlier. Those are solutions like letters of credit, guarantees, foreign bills for collection. It really helps address risk such as counterparty, in some case, country risk, as well as some of the commercial risk. And then the other suite really provides the financing and working capital, from more traditional forms of working capital, overdraft, short-term loans, to more structured solutions like pre- and post-shipment financing, receivable financing, or supply chain or payables financing. And these solutions, especially payables financing, is really important for SMEs because it offers you off-balance sheet financing. To your point, from an ABSA perspective, we offer a full range of trade finance services. We are one of the biggest regional trade finance banks on the continent and have a long and established track record on the continent. Most of our solutions are offered via digital capability. So it really allows clients to manage their trade finance business more efficiently and more effectively. We also support banks that are needing to support their clients trading in Africa. And this is done through a hub concept, which really supports banks that don't have footprints in Africa, but need to support their clients who trade here. The key is just to reach out to your bank to understand what solutions are available and how best to use these solutions. Again, that you focus on what you do best, which is growing your business and diversifying revenue pools.
Thank you for that. I think that's extremely helpful for our audience to understand. There's a question that came up about data. I want to pose it to you, Michelle, but I'm going to also mention it for Das Richardson as well. But the question about how to really drill down as companies are considering opportunities. And so they've started the MISC litigation, they've worked with you on access to finance, but how to really hone in on maybe sort of industry sectoral needs or sort of matching that skill set or that solution they have to sort of the demand on the continent. Does the bank work with clients in that space as well?
Absolutely. So we have access to a lot of data that looks at trade flows between, for example, the US and the markets that we operate in. We have access to other databases that shows opportunities of companies between the two continents. And also, of course, just engaging with our own clients on the continent, we get a good understanding of where they're looking to expand or who their counterparties are. A great starting point is just to contact our office in the US if you are looking to expand and you're looking for opportunities, and we can work to understand how we can connect you with counterparties in the markets we operate.
Wonderful. And we'll take you up on that, Michelle, and perhaps share some information following this webinar with companies who are seeking to connect around further details. Das Richardson, thank you. I imagine that the commercial guides also give some clue in terms of what are key industry or sectoral things that are being purchased or that are key sort of trade spaces within markets. But also I would imagine Prosper Africa as a US government initiative keeps some data or is helping to sort of connect interested buyers or solution sets with need as well. Could you say a bit more about that?
Sure. So I mentioned earlier, Kendra, that we're information brokers, but I also gave you some statistics. So if we don't do anything else, we work with data all day, every day from the Commerce Department. So I would treat the country commercial guides as sort of initial reference tools because by the time they're published, the information is old, and we know that, right? So then there are two other options available to companies. One is free and one is a small fee. The free option is we put out market intelligence reports on a fairly regular basis. And in these market intelligence reports usually have some sort of a call to action. So they might feature, they might focus on an event happening that would be of interest. They might focus on a new trend. They might focus on a new law or regulation. How does that impact the market? And to find out more, visit X, Y, or Z, or do X, Y, or Z. So the market intelligence reports are a really good tool for businesses to track and follow on the trade.gov website. You know, you pick your market, you pick your industry, and then you look for these reports. The second type of report that we deal in is a customized market research report, where essentially you as a company fill out your own individual survey, and then for a small fee, we do the research for you depending on the scope of work, and then come back with a very detailed report that will help you, that's individualized and unique to your company, that will help you to enter the market based on that data. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that when you're involved in trade, you have to know your harmonized code. We're able to take your harmonized code and do research based on that in terms of getting specific data on trade flows. So if you have your harmonized code, then we're able to also match that up with a country's, customs regulations and laws, and you'll get an information from our specialists about on the ground about what kind of tariffs you might expect. Now, of course, in Africa, we're looking at the formation of the African Continental Free Trade Area, right? So all the more reason to have a partner inside the AFCFTA, or to think about setting up shop or having a business within the African Continental Free Trade Area, because then you're not necessarily dealing with the tariffs that would be set up for all companies coming in from outside of Africa.
Well, I'm glad that you mentioned the AFCFTA, because I was going to offer all of you all the opportunity to sort of respond and a closing question as we come to a close of the moderated discussion. We had a question in the chat around the status and the future of AGOA, which we know the African Growth and Opportunity Act is scheduled to expire in 2025, but it really speaks to exports from the African continent coming to the United States. But the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement that initiated trading last year is really breaking down barriers across the continent to not just for intra-African trade, but also to create opportunities for US exporters. And if I could, maybe I'll start with you, Das Richardson. I'll go to Ambassador Dos Santos, and then to Michelle. As sort of our closing question, we know the AFCFTA has this vast potential and particularly offers a lot of opportunity for small businesses. So as we close out today, if you have any thoughts around the AFCFTA or other sort of last considerations you would want the members on this call to consider when they think about the opportunity to export to or invest in the continent.
Great. Well, thank you for that opportunity, Kendra. So the African Continental Free Trade Area, or the AFCFTA for short, is essentially going to progressively eliminate tariffs on intra-African trade. So right now, intra-African trade is limited because of infrastructure challenges and because every country has its own system. So this is set to eliminate all of that progressively. and to help African businesses to grow and to benefit from trade as part of Africa's own mission to become self-sustaining. So the AFCFTA is expected to expand Africa's economy to $29 trillion by 2050. And it's an agreement that 54 African countries have signed on to. And the idea behind it is that this will help to lift 30 million people on the African continent out of extreme poverty. It's also expected to boost income by 7% on the continent, which translates to approximately $450 billion with a B dollars by 2035. So again, we talked at the very beginning of this panel about leaving money on the table. If you don't have partners inside of that area or a plan to be inside of that area, you are again leaving money on the table. You don't want to wait until it's too late. It's going to take a while for a free trade area of this size and this complexity to be implemented. And of course, we are looking for ways to offer whatever support is desired by the AFCFTA. As a matter of fact, their Secretary General, His Excellency Kelly Mene, has met with our Deputy Secretary on several occasions. The first meeting actually took place at the Chamber. And so they've developed quite a nice rapport. And at the last meeting that they had, I think it was maybe 2 months ago or so, 2 or 3 months ago, was His Excellency Secretary General Mene was appealing to our Deputy Secretary on how can we get more small and medium-sized enterprises, more SMEs doing business in Africa under the AFCFTA. So there is a desire to have more SMEs engaging in trade through leveraging this vehicle. And I believe as part of this series, Kendra, we're going to have another one of these with our Deputy Secretary during the week of the Africa Leader Summit on the 13th of December, are we not? And we're going to live stream it. So if you can't be there, you can be on a platform like this listening in about what the opportunities are and hear from, big voices that have that 100,000-foot view and are busy right now designing policies and programs to support more increased trade and investment by SMEs to take advantage of this area. And you can be sure, as you mentioned earlier, that sites like Prosper Africa at prosper.gov will capture all of the different U.S. government programs that are being built up and will be delivered at this Africa Leader Summit in December. So for me, the most important part after December is what comes next. And so we hope through this series, through our collaboration with the Chamber, to tee all of you up to really start thinking about how can I not leave money on the table? How can I pull up a seat to the table and enjoy this meal that is being laid out before us by African and by the U.S. government? Over.
Thank you, Das Richardson, and thank you for your participation today. Ambassador dos Santos, may I invite you to offer some closing comments with a reference to the opportunity that the AFCFTA provides small business?
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, Kendra. The Continental Free Trade Area Treaty is a culmination of the efforts of the continent for regional integration. We go back to the Abuja Treaty that led to the establishment of the regional economic communities. And the major difference and perhaps distinction that we find today with the AFCFTA is that it has an umbrella, which is Agenda 2063, which is the main document that guides political action, guides economic action. It guides the relationship that the continent wants to have that Africa that we want. And beyond that, the leaders of the continent decided to establish technical working groups, starting with ministerial, sectoral ministerial level meetings that discuss the nitty-gritties of such a complex process. And that's why this time, if you didn't believe that the previous treaties could achieve what Africans want to achieve, This time you can see that there is interest, and the establishment of the Secretariat in Accra is another show of the commitment, the political commitment and political will that African leaders have and the African peoples want to have to develop intra-African trade and develop good partnerships with the world. Now, the numbers have been given. I think Camille did a great job in terms of giving the numbers, in terms of the impact of this. Now, when you deal with a region that is better organized, you have a bigger market. It's no longer the 31 million people in Mozambique, but is 1.7 billion people of the continent of Africa that will be your market. And with an increasing buying capacity, with an increasing level of technological development, because the sectors within Agenda 2063 looks at infrastructure development, science and technology, and all other areas of economic activity, including mining, trying to harmonize policy, harmonize procedures, and have a seamless process for economic integration on the continent. I'm a very optimistic African, and I see a bright future for the continent of Africa, and great return on investment and huge profits for those who want to work with Africans to develop the continent and develop the people of Africa.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you for that really rousing endorsement of this opportunity. Let me turn now to Michelle Knowles to invite her a closing word related to the opportunity for small business through ABCFTA and through the work of ABSA.
Great. Thanks again. I think a really good overview of what the free trade agreement is aimed to do, which is really to remove barriers and increase the amount of trade between African countries and increase global trade. Of course, access to trade finance is critical to support this trade, which we've discussed as such a key enabler for economic growth. Yet, despite this, access to trade finance does remain a challenge. Only 40% of demand has currently been met. And SMEs are the most impacted, in particular youth and women-owned businesses. The reasons for this are varied, but cost of regulation in the sector has increased, and that increases cost and complexity. You know, there's always this perceived creditworthiness of SMEs, lack of credit data, and foreign currency availability, which persist when it comes to trade finance. So increasing the financing available to these critical contributors to the economy can really increase the trading potential of many thousands of individual and small businesses. In ABSA, there's significant focus on how we increase accessibility to these solutions by partnering with DFIs, multilateral development banks, to increase liquidity available for financing. And as mentioned, we're also supplementing this with digital capability. So we increase access and we simplify the process. We also have many initiatives and solutions that focus on capacity building across the group. However, there remain structural issues that do need to be dealt around regulations, policies, capacity building, and this really can only be done through the ongoing collaboration between policymakers, banks, the DFIs, the multilateral development banks, as well as fintechs. I don't think any one party can solve the issues, which is why sessions like today are so critical. From an ABSA perspective, we're posed and really ready to support our clients in terms of the free trade agreement.
Thank you for that, Michelle. And I can say by the chat, you will have a few more clients knocking your door. I think there's an interest in learning a little bit more about the tools that you talked about today. And really for all of our panelists, for the great insights that you shared with this community so that they can take advantage and avail themselves of the tools, the techniques, and the opportunities that your respective organizations provide to be able to get started in trading with the continent. So thank you for that. I'd now like to turn the mic over to our president, Scott Eisner, with some closing words. Scott, over to you.
Thank you so much to Chamber friends and family, to Ellington Arnold, our fearless leader on our Advance with Africa work behind the scenes, really making sure today's discussion was valuable. And thank you to all of our speakers, ambassadors, business leaders, those who are at the front lines, understanding what risk really is and dealing with the perceptions around that. Today's conversation and all of our conversations around Advance with Africa are really connecting the dots, connecting the people, and connecting the resources. And I'm so humbled to hear so many of these life lessons that have been shared by each of you to enable those on the call today to the next level of investment and engagement. The AFCFTA, the Africa Leaders Summit, and the Business Forum the Chamber is proud to be partners on, and all of our AmCham network across the continent are valuable resources for each and every one of you. Please continue to stay in touch with us. Please continue to engage. As Camille mentioned, we will have a further session with some luminaries around the Africa Leaders Summit as we touch DC with our Advance with Africa program. And as we look towards next year, we'll be hitting markets like Houston, Seattle, Chicago, New York, perhaps, and a few others as we build our momentum and build our capacity towards bringing trade delegations to the continent with your investment decisions in mind and partnerships with entities like the Commerce Department, Prosper Africa, the whole of government, but really through our partnerships. And thanks again to NADEC and to Susan Sterling, as well as to ABSA, one of our national champions. Understanding the financial implications of investment have to be front and center. And so thank you, Michelle, for your continued investments in our work. We'll be coming back to you shortly with polls and information. We want to make sure that as we build this series that you continue to stay engaged. So thank you all for staying with us today, for retaining the knowledge, and most of all for your partnership and yearning to be a part of this Africa investment story that's unfolding in real time. So thank you all and have a great day.